Hello and welcome to A Genteel Black Hole, the home of my bookish rambles. My name's Ali, and this is a book all about wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. Before I get on with reviewing this book, I just have a few personal notes. If you don't really care about all of that stuff, there's timestamps in the description, so you can just skip on to the review if you wish. Anyway, if you've followed my channel for a while, you might have remembered at the start of the year, I expressed my intention to read more classics, more kind of heavy, nourishing classic books. And that plan has somewhat backfired on me these past few months. And I've found that actually what I need is more variety and, frankly, some more self-care. So this past few months, one of my strategies has been to read more children's literature, to which end I made a video all about becoming a fan of the Moomins. One of my other strategies has been to immerse myself in my established fandoms. I read a massive book about Cardiacs, one of my favourite bands, and the other book I read was this book about Doctor Who. I have been a Whovian for at least the last 20 years. I started properly watching it with the very first series of the revival era with Christopher Eccleston, but even before that, I think I was being primed to be a Whovian despite the show being in its wilderness years. I remember watching the Paul McGann TV movie and being really into it, and then having nothing else available to watch. We only had terrestrial TV when I was growing up, so I didn't have access to the repeats of Doctor Who on Gold or whatever channel it was on. And even before that, I remember seeing Dimensions in Time, the notoriously terrible Children in Need special in 1993. So I would have been like 7. And of course, I didn't know any better. I really enjoyed it. I've since gone back and watched it on YouTube because it's one of the few things that doesn't have an official release. But it is pretty bad. But it's also kind of nice to see so many of the stars of the classic era gathered together in one place. But I am now rambling. The point is that I am a huge Whovian. Now, I should qualify that I'm a huge Whovian compared with most people I know, but I'm also a big enough Whovian to realise that there are Whovians far, far bigger than me. So although I have watched the entire modern series as it aired, never missed an episode, and I've also gone back and watched almost as much of the classic era as is available, there are people who have dedicated their lives to Doctor Who in a way that I just haven't and won't. I have far too many other interests to dedicate myself to one thing, to Doctor Who or any other thing with that level of obsessiveness. So this is a review from the perspective of a fairly big fan, but not as big as the people who run dedicated Doctor Who channels, etc. This is a general bookish channel, and although you might have spotted my little TARDIS in the corner with Patrick Troughton peeking out of the door, yeah, I'm not as enormous of a Whovian as the people who, as I say, dedicate their lives to it. So maybe bear that in mind when I'm reviewing this book, that that's the perspective that I'm coming from. Big fan, but not like all-encompassingly obsessive. Blimey, that was quite a ramble, wasn't it? Yeah, I haven't recorded for a while and I'm a little bit rusty, so Panda Companion. Recently, I read Exterminate, Regenerate, The Story of Doctor Who by John Higgs. This is a recent publication, I think it came out this year, and it charts the entire history of the making of Doctor Who, right the way from its very beginnings in 1963 all the way to 2025, although it wasn't published recently enough to include the very latest development, which, if you know, you know. But it is, to my knowledge, the most up-to-date and comprehensive history of Doctor Who. While Doctor Who itself might not be strictly in chronological order, this book pretty much is. It starts with the very genesis of Doctor Who as a programme, and it's quite an unusual genesis. If you compare it to something like Star Trek or Star Wars, there isn't really a Gene Roddenberry or George Lucas at the heart of Doctor Who. In fact, it was pretty much created by committee. In the early 60s, the BBC had a gap in their early evening schedules between Grandstand, a sports programme, and Jukebox Jury, a pop music programme. And they needed something to fill that gap that would hopefully appeal to both those disparate audiences. They commissioned a report on the feasibility of sci-fi to fill that gap. And although the report was quite dismissive about sci-fi as a genre, they still decided that that was the thing to do it. And so they set their drama department to create a sci-fi show based on basically nothing other than it had to be a sci-fi show. They opted for time travel as the, I suppose, vehicle for this sci-fi show for a few reasons. For starters, the BBC drama department at the time had plenty of period costumes and sets, so all of the kind of historical settings were already, easily achieved. Also, they intended for it to have some sort of educational value, so whenever they travel back in time, that would inform viewers about history, whilst travelling forward in time and into deep space could be used to inform people about science. And as such, two of the main characters of this show ended up being a history teacher and a science teacher. So the invention of such central figures as the Doctor and the TARDIS were kind of afterthoughts. And it's really interesting going back and watching those early episodes and seeing just how different it was to the show that we have today, whilst still putting in place a lot of what remains central to Doctor Who. In this book, John Higgs discusses how Doctor Who doesn't really operate like most fiction. It's kind of common sense that the more specific and nailed down a character's backstory and personality are, the more an audience will connect with it. But Doctor Who kind of relies on its nebulous, ever-changing nature. It's not the same show week by week, month by month, year by year. The William Hartnell series is very different from the Patrick Troughton series. The Sylvester McCoy series is very different from the Peter Capaldi series. You know, pick any two episodes from either side by side or years apart, and they're going to be pretty different, and they're going to have different conceptions of who the Doctor is, what that character's personality is like, what that character's backstory is even. It has changed multiple times over the years, and mystery is really at the heart of it, and possibility, because people are able to kind of fill in the blanks in the way that most intrigues and excites them. And there's something to be said for that. And even if it's a quirk of its bizarre genesis, it has ended up making a show that is eternally renewing and regenerating itself. Editing alley here, coming from the future. It occurred to me while I was editing the video that I neglected to discuss the very concept of regeneration, and given that that's in the title of the book itself, it's kind of a vital factor to the continuing success and sustainability of Doctor Who. When most other franchises recast an actor, there are one of two options, really. They either continue the story with a new actor and just ask the audience to ignore the recast. That's what the Marvel Cinematic Universe did by recasting Edward Norton as Mark Ruffalo. The other solution is to reboot the whole thing from scratch. So, for example, the Ben Affleck Batman is not the same Batman as the Michael Keaton or Christian Bale or Adam West Batmans. Batmen? But in Doctor Who, recasting the main character is actually made part of the fiction. When the Doctor, or another Time Lord, is on the point of death, their body glows with a golden light, and from that glow, a new face is born, and with that new face, a new personality as well. So not only do they recast the actor, they reimagine the entire role whilst remaining part of the continuity, which is what has allowed actors as disparate as William Hartnell, Patrick Troughton, Ncuti Gatwa, and Jodie Whittaker to play the same role in the same continuity. Anyway, back to Past Alley. In fact, Higgs argues that the show has become self-sustaining. It's almost a life form in itself, and it creates each new generation of fans for them to become the next generation of creatives as well. I mean, such notable doctors as David Tennant and Peter Capaldi were massive, obsessive Doctor Who fans in childhood. And in fact, David Tennant wrote an essay at school about how he would one day play the Doctor, which, he wasn't wrong. The book also celebrates childishness in much the way that Doctor Who does. I mean, Tom Baker's Doctor once famously said, "There's no point in being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes." And as Higgs writes in the book, it's innate silliness was one of the programme's great strengths, as it kept the self-important away and prevented them from claiming it for themselves. That it kept adults in touch with their inner child was also a strength, not a weakness. Maturity is not an outgrowing, but a growing up, the American author Ursula K. Le Guin has argued. An adult is not a dead child, but a child who survived. So I really think this book gets to the heart, or should I say hearts, of what makes Doctor Who so beloved by so many. I think it's also a very well-researched book, and it doesn't shy away from some of the uncomfortable aspects of the show's history. It confronts William Hartnell's personal bigotry. It discusses the atmosphere of sexism and racism at the BBC throughout the 20th century, and it also discusses the sexually abusive behaviour of John Nathan Turner, who was the producer of the show throughout the entire 1980s. That said, the chapters covering the 21st century tend to get more vague. Higgs admits himself that people are more guarded nowadays, and due to their kind of intensive media training, you just don't get people being quite as unvarnished and honest nowadays. So we don't know exactly why Christopher Eccleston quit the show after a single season. He has made hints, but he's not been as specific as people were about the behind-the-scenes stuff in the 20th century. And once you get to the most recent stuff, the Ncuti Gatwa era, things get really vague, and it mostly discusses things like the fan reaction to episodes and the viewing figures and the show's place in the culture, without really delving into the kind of behind-the-scenes details that the earlier chapters do. This is by necessity, and it's quite understandable, but I do feel like the book just slightly tails off towards the end. That said, I did still really enjoy it, and I would definitely recommend it if you're a Whovian and you're looking for a book that has a detailed but comprehensive overview of the whole history of the show without being kind of dauntingly in depth. It's just over 400 pages or so, covering 62 years of history. So, that's less than 100 pages per decade. Necessarily, things get left out or boiled down or glossed over. And if you want more in-depth, specific details about any particular era, I expect there are probably other books that will deliver on that. And in fact, there is a full list of sources in the back of this book, so you could always use that to find more books if you so choose. Another aspect I really enjoyed about this book was some of the fascinating and often bizarre biographical details about the actors who have played the Doctor. Jon Pertwee, for example, seems to have led a completely improbable, bizarre life. I mean, here's something that the book says. As a child, his playwright father Roland took him to tea at the house of his friend A.A. Milne. It was here that young John met Milne's son, Christopher Robin, who was dressed in a suit of shining armour. It goes on to say that John met Christopher Robin's toys, including Winnie the Pooh. Actual Winnie the Pooh. Later in life, Jon Pertwee was also a naval intelligence officer during World War II, where he ended up going to security staff meetings with Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond, and the actual Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who would later be a character in Doctor Who, although not during the Jon Pertwee era. But perhaps my favourite quote from the whole book was about the Doctor's two hearts. If you're familiar with Doctor Who, and frankly, if you're not, I don't know why you've got this far in the video, but the Doctor is an alien who has two hearts, and the book says this. Katie Manning, who played Pertwee's companion Jo Grant, has suggested that the reason why the Doctor has two hearts is because one comes from the character and one comes from the actor playing him. Later in the book, it says this. Many Doctors have spoken about the extent that their personal identity has merged with the character, but only Jodie Whittaker went full method and, being pregnant when she filmed her final episode, actually played the role with two hearts. Isn't that lovely? But how about you? Are you a fellow Whovian? Have you read this book, or maybe any other books about the history of Doctor Who that you would recommend over this one? Why not let me know in the comments? Or maybe let me know who your favourite Doctor is, or what your favourite episode is, anything like that. I'm always up for a Whovian chat. But that's about it from me today. I hope you're having a lovely day, and I will see you last week. Wibbly wobbly timey wimey.